Sandhan. All Gujarat integrated classroom.
સેટેલાઇટના માધ્યમથી જોડતી કડી એટલે સંધાન.
Hello students. Today we will discuss A Cup of Tea, a short story written by Catherine Mansfield. Friends, Catherine Mansfield was born in New Zealand in 1888 and she died at a very young age in 1923. We won't be looking at Catherine Mansfield's life in the first part, but in the second part we will go to her life because that will be helpful in our analysis of the story that we are going to discuss today. The story, as I've already told you, is A Cup of Tea. This story was included in The Dove's Nest and Other Stories, a collection edited by Mansfield's husband, John Middleton Murray. John Middleton Murray was a very well-known modern critic and writer. So, John Middleton Murray, after the death of Catherine Mansfield, edited 2 volumes of her short stories along with other poems and other writings by Catherine Mansfield. And this story, which we are going to discuss today, was included in The Dove's Nest and Other Stories, which was edited in 1923 by John Middleton Murray. Coming to the story straight away, this story has let's say 5 characters. Rosemary Fell is the protagonist or the main character around whom the entire story moves or revolves. Philip is her husband. Miss Smith is a poor girl. There's a shopkeeper in an antique shop and that is another character, and Jean is another character who is a servant or a maid at Catherine's house. When we look at the story in a nutshell, this is a story of a very wealthy young lady who has been married for 2 years, and she's married to a person called Philip. It has been written here Peter, but then it is Philip. She's married to Philip, and they have been married for 2 years now. They are very rich, and Rosemary Fell is very extravagant. She spends a lot and goes shopping in very costly shops, and her husband absolutely adores us. Now, it is said by Catherine Mansfield that she wrote about the characters that somehow talk about herself autobiographically or talk about her own psychological situations that she might have gone through. Here again we will be psychologically analyzing this short story. The short story begins very abruptly. It takes us straight away into the story with the narrator telling us about Rosemary Fell. I'll read the first few lines which are not shown here on the screen that you see, but then I am sure that the students who are attending this have already either read the story and they also have the text along with them while they are let's say following it here on Sandhan. So I'll read the first few lines that will take us straight away into the story. Rosemary Fell was not exactly beautiful. No, you couldn't have called her beautiful. Pretty? Well, if you took her to pieces. But why be so cruel as to take anyone to pieces? She was young, brilliant, extremely modern, exquisitely well dressed, amazingly well read in the newest of the new books, and her parties were the most delicious mixture of really important people and artists, quaint creatures, discoveries of hers, some of them too terrifying for words, but others quite presentable and amusing. Rosemary had been married 2 years. She had a duck of a boy. No, not Peter, Michael. And her husband absolutely adored her. They were rich, really rich. Not just comfortably well off, which is odious and stuffy and sounds like one's grandparents. But if Rosemary wanted to shop, she would go to Paris as you and I would go to Bond Street. If she wanted to buy flowers, the car pulled up at that perfect shop in the Regent Street, and Rosemary inside the shop just gazed in her dazzled, rather exotic way and said, "I want those and those and those. Give me 4 bunches of those. And that jar of roses. Yes, I'll have all the roses in the jar. No, no lilac. I hate lilacs. It's got no shape." The attendant bowed and put the lilac out of sight, as though this was only too true. Lilac was dreadfully shapeless. "Give me those stumpy little tulips, those red and white ones." And she was followed to the car by a thin shop girl staggering under an immense white paper armful that looked like a baby in long clothes. So the first paragraph takes us straight away into the story. The narrator starts with Rosemary Fell was not exactly beautiful. Now, straight away, you are introduced to a character, the protagonist, and the narrator tells us about her physical appearance. And he says that she wasn't beautiful, but then she was pretty, and she made for, let's say, the beauty that she might have lacked by her extravagance, again by her parties, which was a mixture of various important people who came there, various artists whom she might have assembled due to her tastes, which were quite different or modern, or you could say which belong to the upper strata of the society that she represents over here. So Rosemary Fell, who is a very rich lady, not a very beautiful but a pretty lady, is the main character here. She has been married for 2 years now when the story begins, but then he says that if you want to call her pretty, then you will have to take her to pieces. And he says that why be so cruel as to take anyone to pieces? But then this becomes important, because when we'll be analyzing the story, we'll know that when we take the story into different pieces, when we try to deconstruct it into different pieces, the story has different meanings or may have different relevance for us and can be analyzed from various points of view. We will try to analyze this poem from the point of view of deconstruction, and again from the point of view of a psychoanalysis or psychological analysis of the mental framework of the author, not the narrator, but the author, Catherine Mansfield. But that will do in the second half. So Rosemary Fell was married to Philip. It has been wrongly written here, Peter, but then it should be Philip, for 2 years. They were very rich, but then they didn't have any issue, they didn't have any children. Rosemary is very extravagant and goes shopping in very costly shops, which tells us about her upper strata. And her husband absolutely adored her. He loved her. He was a duck of a boy. Now, duck of a boy is a phrase that is used here. Duck of a boy means that he was her darling, or he was very dear to her. Darling, the word means very dear, too dear. So he was very dear to her. But if Rosemary wanted to shop, she would go to Paris as you and I would go to Bond Street. This again becomes very important. The writer or the narrator not only introduces us to the character very abruptly in the very first line, but then he also tries to involve the reader in the reading process. And as this line tells us from the story, that but if Rosemary wanted to shop, she would go to Paris as you and I. You and I here means the author and the reader. So the students who are reading this or are following this through Sandhan have been here mentioned as you, and in that sense the narrator takes the readers along, and he involves let's say again the readers in the story itself. The reader becomes a part of the story. And here when he says you and I would go to Bond Street, which means that the social stature that the author thinks that a middle class man has was way low than what Rosemary Fell had. Okay, so because she was very extravagant, she was very rich. Okay. One winter afternoon, she goes to an antique shop for shopping. But before that, as I had read the first paragraph, we see that whenever even if she wants to buy a bunch of flowers, she would just pull into a shop in the Regent Street. The Regent Street would be, let's say, one of the most popular, or let's say a street where mostly the important and rich people go in a given, let's say, city. Just for example, if the students of Surat are, let's say, listening to this lecture, then you have important streets in Surat, or if you have students from Ahmedabad, you have important streets in Ahmedabad, where you know that very rich people frequent those streets. So the Regent Street that is mentioned over here. So she would go there, and again she would never ask for the price of the things that she wanted to buy. Suppose she wanted to buy flowers, she would say, give me those and those and those. Okay, and again she would say what she liked and what she did not like. And again she would buy so many flowers that when the attendant would carry them to her car, it would look more like a baby that is being carried to the car. So she would buy, let's say, in very large numbers, and it would be very difficult for even the attendant to carry them, because the word that is used in the story, if you have the story with you towards the end of the first paragraph, is the attendant staggered. Okay, so there's this staggering because of the weight, and again weight of the flowers, which tells us about Rosemary. So Rosemary, the main character, has been introduced to us in the first paragraph. She has been introduced to us as Peter's wife. They have been married for 2 years. Her husband adores her. They are very rich. She goes to very let's say costly shops even to buy flowers and other things. She gives parties in which she invites various artists and important people. And after that, as the story begins, we are told about, the reader is told about the incident that took place one winter afternoon when Rosemary Fell goes to an antique shop. This shop was probably frequented by Rosemary Fell. She had a particular liking for this particular shop. For those students who might be following this with their books, could go to that part of, let's say, the story where she enters the antique shop, and the shopkeeper flatters her and says, I love my things. I would rather not part with them than sell them to someone who does not appreciate them, who has not the fine feeling which is so rare. And so here very materialistically, where the shopkeeper tries to tell her that he appreciates or he likes the things that he sells, or he is very passionate about the things that he sells, and so he will not sell them to anybody. He will sell them only to the selected few. And in that sense, probably he is trying to flatter the customer, Rosemary, who is over there, or he is trying to sell it to her by telling her that her shop, or let's say his shop, has various important things which only those people who have an eye for art can appreciate and buy. And that is why he says that I would rather not sell them to people who do not appreciate them. Now he shows her, now today when she goes to this shop, he shows her an exquisite little enamel box. On the lid, a miniature creature stood under a flowery tree, and a more miniature creature still had her arms around his neck. Her hat, really no bigger than a geranium petal, hung from a branch. It had green ribbons, and there was a pink cloud like a watchful cherub floating above their heads. So, very minutely, the narrator describes the minute creature and the clouds and the pink and blue combination of the enameled colored little box that is shown to her in an antique shop. Now, again, it's a work of art that she sees. Even the cherub or even the clouds that have been represented, or even the woman that has been represented over here, are very minute, okay, and that is, they are, let's say, engraved on the lid, and that is why you need to have an eye to appreciate the art that is present over there. And there was a pink cloud like a watchful cherub floating above their heads. Rosemary took her hands out of her long gloves. She always took off her gloves to examine such things. Yes, she liked it very much. She loved it. It was a great duck. She must have it. Now, as we are reading it, and I'm sure the students are following it with their books, what Rosemary does is, the first thing that she does is she takes off her gloves. That is, she is interested in the thing that is shown to her, and she wants to physically touch it, and that is why she removes her glove. And she always took off her gloves to examine such things. She loved such things. She had an appreciation for art, probably. Yes, she liked it very much. Okay, and she loved it. It was a great duck. We have seen the word duck appear even before, towards the starting of the story, in which she describes her husband as a duck of a boy. And I said that duck of a boy would mean darling, or someone who is very dear, someone who is very near. And here she said that she loved it. It was a duck. It was very dear to her. So she must have it. And whatever happens, she should possess it. To have it means to possess it. She should have it. And turning the creamy box, opening and shutting it, she couldn't help noticing how charming her hands were against the blue velvet. Now, the blue velvet of the box, the pink color of the cloud, the cherub, and again the things or the images engraved on the lid are very important when we analyze the poem, when we analyze the, let's say, story. We will talk about them in detail, but then I would want the students to underline these parts, so that when we come back to it in the second part, you can identify those lines quickly, and we can follow the analysis in that same manner. She asks its price. We had seen this before, that when she goes to buy flowers, she would never ask for the price. She would say, I want this and this and this, or give me those and those and those. And she never asked, because again she was very rich. But then here she says, she asks for its price. Shopkeeper says 28 guineas. Madam, now 28 guineas for a person who is very rich, stinkingly rich, is not a very great sum. But still, Rosemary feigns that it is too costly for her, but asks the shopkeeper to keep it for her. She stared at a plump tea kettle like a plump hen above the shopman's head. Again, if you have come with your pencil or pen, please underline here a plump tea kettle like a plump hen, so that when we come back to it in the analysis section, you can identify those lines. Above the shopkeeper's head, and her voice was dreamy as she answered, well, keep it for me, will you? I will, ... Okay, which means that she wants it, she must have it, but then she cannot buy it. And she asks the shopkeeper to keep it for her, to preserve it for her, so that later on she can come and buy it from him. Now, she moves out of the shop. Now, a cup of tea. Here, the story talks about the price of a cup of tea, which will come later. And this was the background which tells us about Rosemary Fell, which tells us about her family, which tells us about her riches, about her social stature, and about art that she likes, and her different sojourns in different parts of the cities that are, let's say, with very spectacular shops and things that they sell. She moves out of the shop, not buying anything. When she went to the flower shop, she bought so many flowers that the attendant staggered under the weight of the flowers. Whereas here, she moves out of the shop and does not buy anything. The discreet door shut with a click. Again, I would ask the students to underline discreet door, okay, so that when we come back to it, we can analyze it. Discreet would mean secret, would mean deceptive, okay. So the discreet door shut with a click. There are moments, horrible moments in life, when one emerges from shelter and looks out, and it's awful. When she moves out of the shop, the outside atmosphere is awful. That is, the outside atmosphere has changed a lot, which we will see. As she moves outside, you find that she thinks that the lamps burn with sadness, that there is a slight drizzle, and people are walking with their umbrellas, and they are probably hiding themselves behind those umbrellas. And Rosemary Fell, who just had to, let's say, cross the pavement, and there was a car standing for her, and which would drive her home, still she feels as though unable to move, and stands on the pavement as though waiting for something. The outside world appears sad, and people are hiding behind umbrellas to prevent rain. But at the very instant of thinking that a young girl, thin, dark, shadowy, where had she come from? Okay, please underline where had she come from, was standing at Rosemary's elbow, and a voice like a sigh, almost a sob, breathed, "Madam, may I speak to you a moment?" And she's standing there. She is depressed because she could not buy the artifact that she wanted to buy. When she comes out, she thinks that the entire atmosphere is very melancholic, very sad, and she just had to cross the pavement to go on the other side, but then still she waits over there, and that is the time when a girl comes to her, and she asks her if she could speak to her for a moment. "Speak to me." Rosemary turned. She saw a little battered creature with enormous eyes, someone quite young, no older than herself, who clutched at her coat collar with reddened hands and shivered as though she had just come out of water. Again, just come out of water should be underlined, and when we analyze it again, we'll see that previously we have underlined where had she come from, and here there's a probable answer. She seemed as though she has just come out of water, and it may have metaphorical and symbolic meanings as we analyze it in the second part. But then all of a sudden, probably from nowhere, she finds someone who stands at her elbow and asks whether she can speak to her. "Madam," stammered the voice, "would you let me have a price of a cup of tea?" "A cup of tea?" said Rosemary. "Have you no money at all?" asked Rosemary. "None, madam," came the answer. "How extraordinary," said Rosemary. Now again, there is this conversation between a stranger girl who is unknown to Rosemary, and again with Rosemary, who is a very rich lady and who is standing there somewhat depressed that she could not buy an artifact. Her mood is very melancholy, and there she finds this girl, and now you see that in their conversation that melancholy has gone, that sadness is not evident over here. She stepped forward and said to the dim person beside her, "Come home to tea with me." And Rosemary tells her that if you want tea, you may come home to tea with me. Generally, if someone asks us for the price of tea, we would rather, let's say, if we wish, we would give that person some money so that that person can have some tea for himself or herself, and we move on to our, let's say, world or our work or our life. But then here, Rosemary looks at that person and she says that come home to tea with me. If you want tea, come home with me and I will serve you tea. Initially, the girl was afraid and resisted. The girl drew back, startled. You don't mean it, madam, said the girl. And the girl again, who had come, though she did not look like a beggar, but then she had come asking for alms, because she was asking in a way begging, because she wanted a favor from Rosemary for the price of a cup of tea. But then when she is asked to come along, she is startled, and she does not believe that a wealthy woman, a rich woman like Rosemary would ask her to come home with her. But I do, cried Rosemary. I want you to please me, come along. Again, to please me should be underlined, so that when we come back to the story, we can analyze it in that way. So she says that yes, you should come along, you should come to my place and I will serve you tea. Again, there's this line, hungry people are easily led. That again should be underlined. And here, this battered creature, this girl who was hungry, was easily led. That is what is told to us. And she goes to, let's say, Rosemary's house to have her cup of tea. The footman held the door of the car open, and a moment later they were skimming through the dusk. The atmosphere was very dusky. Dusky means very foggy. It was very blurred, and when you are dreaming, when you are imagining, the atmosphere is blurred. And again, that word dim has been used before when Rosemary talks about the girl. She says she stepped forward and said to the dim person behind her. Dim, again, the person who is here not very well off, very weak, feeble probably, but dim can again be seen in relation to dusky or haziness or fogginess or some sort of an obstacle in seeing things or seeing people. Okay, so here that dim and dusky, okay, both of these words or images can go together to probably tell us about something imagined, something imaginary, something dreamt, okay, or something that is not for real probably, okay, something that is a creation of some sort of an imagination probably, okay. So here the door of the car open, and a moment later they were skimming through the dusk. She had a feeling of triumph as she slipped her hand through the velvet strap. Now Rosemary Fell, who just walked out of the shop, was feeling very depressed, and as this girl agrees to go along with her, she feels that she has won something, and she takes the girl along with her to her house. When she takes her there, she let's say takes her upstairs to her house, to her bedroom. She asks her to feel comfortable, asks her to remove her hat, she asks her to remove her coat, she asks her to let's say sit in a deep chair so that she may relax, but then Rosemary forgets to serve her tea, and that is when this poor little girl says that if I do not have anything to eat or drink, I may faint, I may go off, madam. And that is the time when suddenly she realizes that this little creature needs some tea, that this battered creature is hungry, feeble, and so she shouts or she calls for tea, and tea is served. When this tea is served, Rosemary Fell starts talking to her, and she tells her that they are like sisters. She tells her that both of them are women. She tells her that again probably Rosemary is more fortunate, but then both of them belong to the same class, and that again inspires a sort of, let's say, a feminist way of looking at the story, because a story can be seen in various different ways. But when we go to the progression of the story, we find that there is some sort of an attachment between the two, that these words or these lines tell us about relationship between two women talking to each other, sharing, let's say, that space, though they belong to two very different worlds. One is very rich and the other is probably very poor. Rosemary serves her tea, serves her biscuit, fills her cups as soon as they are empty, and they are about to talk to each other, where Rosemary asks her as to when did she have her last meal. But before the girl can answer, the door opens and Philip, that is Rosemary Fell's husband, walks in. As he walks in, he sees that there is a stranger, an unknown woman or a lady or a girl who is occupying the bedroom of his wife, and suddenly he apologizes for coming straight away, and there Rosemary says that, meet my friend, Miss, and she actually has not asked the girl's name as yet, and she does not know what is the name of the girl. But then the girl says, Miss Smith. Here again, when Philip enters, he sees that the hat and the coat and the clothes of the girl are lying on the floor of the house, and he stands beside fire, near the fireplace, and he looks at the boots and the hair of the girl, and he tries to, let's say, analyze the social status of the girl, whether she should belong to the friendship or the circle of Rosemary or not. And he calls Rosemary and says that if Miss Smith will excuse us, could you come for a word with me to the library. He goes to the library, and here Rosemary follows. When Rosemary goes there, he asks her about Miss Smith, who she is, and again here Rosemary tells him that she is a real pick. A real pick is a word that has been used in the text for students who might have their texts with them. And she says that I brought her along with me for a cup of tea. But then she does not say a cup of tea. She says that she had brought her with her. Now he says that, what do you intend to do with her? And she says that I wish to be nice to her. Wish to be frightfully nice to her. Okay. Now, being nice to someone and frightfully here, extremely nice to her. Okay, so that is what she has brought her for. The intention of bringing the girl to the house. Philip tries to, let's say, explain to her that we should not bring strangers to our place. But then what he says is, my darling girl, he is addressing his wife, said Philip, you are quite mad, you know, it simply can't be. But said Philip slowly, and he cut the end of the cigar. She is so astonishingly pretty. Now, that biting of the end of the cigar tells us that there is some sort of a connivance, that probably he is using those words deliberately, and he says that she is so pretty. Rosemary says, do you think so? I hadn't thought about it. And Rosemary said that I had never thought that she looked pretty. Now, what did Rosemary think then? That is what we'll be analyzing. Because Rosemary did not see the girl as she was. She saw the girl as she imaginatively wanted to see someone. Now, who that someone is will be analyzed in the second part of this story of the lecture. Rosemary goes back to her bedroom, and she brings out three, let's say, 5 pound notes and gives it to Miss Smith, and she asks her to leave. She again goes back to her husband Philip, but this time, after putting on a bit of makeup, after trying to be more beautiful or more pretty, or let's say more attractive, because probably her husband, who has used the words that she is very pretty, her husband even said that I was bowled over when I saw her first, which again would here give an inclination that probably Rosemary was jealous of the girl, and that is why she has put on that makeup. But then again, when we analyze it, we will try to see whether she was jealous or not. But then it is thought that women are jealous of each other. Being a man, I can't say whether that is true always, but then it is a general belief that women are jealous of each other, which may not be true always, but it becomes a part of the story, and we generally analyze it due to that a belief that has come down to us, which again may not be true. And here again, whether it is true or not will be seen towards the end when we try to analyze it. She comes there and she sits on her husband's knees. She put up her hands and touched Philip's cheeks, that is, she again goes closer to him physically, and she asks him, "Do you like me?" she said, and her tone, sweet, husky, troubled him. So the tone in which she asked her husband, "Do you like me?" is an imperative sentence, where probably the answer would be yes. But then probably this sentence here may be seen as a sort of an envy, because her husband had praised the other girl. But then is it really envy or not? That again we'll try to see. "Do you like me?" said she, and her tone, sweet, husky, troubled him. "I like you awfully," he said. Awfully, very much. He said that he likes her very much. Then Rosemary said dreamily, "I saw a fascinating little box today. It cost 28 guineas. May I have it?" But that was not really what she wanted to say. She asks her husband that if she can have a box which fascinated her, which costs 28 guineas, but then instantly or very immediately in the next line, the narrator tells us that but that was not really what Rosemary wanted to say. And now the analysis is the identification, or trying to know as to what Rosemary wanted to say. Though the story ends with, "Am I pretty?" she again asks her husband, "Am I pretty? Am I attractive?" And again, the analysis, as when we do it, we'll try to see whether again that was what her concern was. Her prettiness, her beauty, her attractiveness towards her husband, was that a concern, or was there something more or something different going on in her psychological terrain or in her thought process? Now, looking at the story from this point of view, if we try to, let's say, summarize this story as it is generally done, the summary at a very let's say initial level talks about a very rich woman and a very poor woman. A very rich woman who finds a very poor girl, Smith, who wants tea because she is shivering in cold, there is drizzle. She takes her home to show her generosity, that she is very generous. Okay, as it is written over here in the text when you read it, that she wanted to prove to the world or prove to this girl that fairies and godmothers still exist. Again, she again thought that this might be an incident which can be compared to an incident in Dostoevsky's novel, something that comes straight away from. When she takes her home, she probably wants to show her that she is more generous, that even rich people have heart, that rich people want to help the poor lot. Now when she takes her home, she feeds her, she serves her tea, but that is the time when her husband enters. Her husband is surprised to see a stranger in his wife's bedroom, a stranger girl, let's say, in his wife's bedroom. And as the story on the initial level, if we see it, would, let's say, suggest that probably he was attracted towards her. When we analyze it, I truly feel that Philip was not attracted towards, let's say, Miss Smith. But then why did he do it? We'll try to, let's say, find out in the second part of the analysis. But then, as the story tells us on the initial level, on the surface level, that he was attracted towards her, and he calls his wife to the library and asks her whether Miss Smith is going to stay for dinner. And that is where he tells her that she is very attractive, that he was bowled over. And that is the time when Rosemary realizes that the girl she has brought home is a grown-up girl. It was, let's say, referred to in the, let's say, during the initial meeting also, when Rosemary said that she was quite her own age, not elder than her. Okay, so they were not, let's say, there was not much difference in their age. So that girl was again a grown-up girl. And when her husband talks about the girl as pretty, as attractive, Rosemary feels jealous or envious about it, and she sends the girl off. Probably that is what her husband Philip wanted, because if he would have been attracted towards her, he wouldn't tell his wife that he was attracted towards her. But then he tells his wife that he is attracted towards her, that she is a grown-up girl, that she is a pretty girl, probably so that she might send her away. And that is what happened. And Rosemary pays her some money, gives her some money, and sends her away. Now, materialistically, when we look at this story, you could say that it talks about two different types of economical stretches, where Rosemary belongs to a place where she can buy what she wants. And even here, when she pays 5 rupee, let's say 3 notes of £5 to the girl, probably she has paid her for her visit. Probably she had paid her for getting rid of her, because actually the girl did not ask her for money. She only asked her for a cup of tea. If she wanted to pay her or give her money, Rosemary could have given her money on the pavement itself. She needn't have brought her along with her to her house. But then she brings her along with her. But then when her husband tells her that she is attractive, that she is pretty, probably knowing that if he expresses his ideas thus, Rosemary might send her off. And that is what happens. But then she again sends her off with that money, which tells us that she weighed everything economically. Even when we go back, when she goes to the flower shop, when she buys, she is a rich woman, and that again tells us about the economical stature of the woman. Again, when the narrator tells us that she would go to Paris for shopping, which again tells us that she is a very rich woman. Again, materialistically, when we look at her visit to the antique shop, the way the shopkeeper tries to sell his artifacts to her is a way of trying to flatter the customer and tell the customer that it is the thing is valuable not because I sell it, but because you will own it. It is a valuable thing, and that is why you should have that thing. That is, let's say, an analysis of the story at a very surface level. In the second part, we will try to analyze this entire story from the psychological point of view, and we will try to deconstruct it textually, so that we can come to a really different meaning of the text. Again, it is very important that literature exists on various levels. You can analyze literature according to various theories, various points of view, and literature is important because it does not have a singular meaning. Literature should mean different things to different people in different circumstances, and that is why different people can identify with that type of literature. Again, creativity and art is associated with the creation of something, and when we say creation is not a story as it progresses. Creativity is the nuances of the stories as to where a writer prefers to give us what sort of information is a part of the story. How the story progresses becomes important. Just for an example, in this story, the narrator is an omnipresent narrator. An omnipresent narrator would mean that the narrator is present everywhere. He knows as to what Rosemary thinks, he knows as to what Rosemary is going to do, he follows Rosemary and other characters, and we come to know about the story from this very narrator. But then this omnipresent narrator exists in the story in a limited form. In a limited form means there is a limited omnipresent narrator, which would mean that the narrator tells us about Rosemary Fell, the narrator tells us what she feels, the narrator tells us what she goes through, what she experiences, but the narrator does not tell us anything about Smith as to what she feels internally. The narrator does not tell us about Philip, that is her husband. He does not tell us about what goes on in the mental psychological process of the shopkeeper or the driver or the other people who have been shown as part of the story. We only know about the internal thought process of Rosemary Fell. And so, though we have an omnipresent narrator, the omnipresent narrator narrates in a limited way. Okay? Thank you. We will discuss the story, analyze the story in the second part.
Sandhan. All Gujarat Integrated Classroom.
સેટેલાઇટના માધ્યમથી જોડતી કડી એટલે સંધાન.